We're missing one of our speakers. Hopefully he will arrive after we start. But let me just start by setting up the discussion we'll be having this morning. The statistics of the war on drugs is sadly too familiar. Nearly half of all drug arrests between 2001 and 2010 were for marijuana. And in that period, over 8 million arrests for marijuana were made, 88% for possession alone. Equally familiar is the racially discriminatory nature of the war on drugs, a war that started ostensibly for purposes of fighting the misperceived dangers of crack cocaine, but has since morphed into largely a war on marijuana for the reasons we'll be talking about this morning. And despite all the evidence that shows equal rates of drug use across racial and ethnic lines, blacks are still 3.73 times as likely as whites to be arrested. And in a study done by the ACLU, in particular counties throughout the country, and it is throughout the country, it's not peculiar to one area of the country, but there are individual counties where the rates are 20 or 30 times as high for blacks. The cost of this war, both the human and financial, have been enormous. Billions of dollars have been expended, but the communities of color, which share in, of course, having to finance the war through their taxes, also have disproportionately borne the social costs that are associated with the war on drugs. Those costs, which include the enormous increase in the arrests and incarcerations, have impacted individuals and communities of color in profound and lasting ways. Drug arrests have implications for employment, housing, education, even child custody, each in a way that negatively impacts the opportunities of individuals, but also the opportunities for whole communities. And I think for me and for the work that we do in terms of assuring opportunity for our communities of color, one of the most disturbing things that it is not just an impact in the present, but it goes into the future. Having a parent who is incarcerated removes that parent from the family structure, removes that person from the community, has these impacts on their future educational and employment opportunities, all of which negatively affect the wealth of the individual and the community. So it's an effect that is intergenerational and promises to keep the wealth gap, which we currently have between whites and people of color, and maintain it into the future. And of course, the most frustrating part about the war on drugs and the costs that have been expended in maintaining it is that it has not been effective. That if the goal was to reduce drug use, it has not been effective. And in fact, the United States is the country in the world that has the highest level of drug use. So here this morning, we'd like to talk about the impact, the racial and the ethnic impact of the war on drugs, and particularly the war on marijuana, to look at its cause, to take a look at how we can prevent future harm, and to consider the question of how the communities that have been impacted, that have had resources drained from them because of this policy, how they can and should be made whole going forward. And we've assembled an extraordinary panel to talk about this from three different perspectives, or we've assembled 2 out of 3, and hopefully the third will join us soon. So let me start with introducing each of them. And I will start with Matthew Fogg, who isn't present, but this way, if I mess something up, he won't be here to hear it. He was sworn in by the United States Marshal Service as a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1978, and became a highly decorated federal law officer. He was cross-designated a supervisory special agent in charge of U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration Joint Task Force for Joint Drug and Gun Task Force. He's received a number of awards for for his law enforcement activities, tracking down over 300 of America's most wanted and dangerous fugitives, and he remained at the Marshal Service until he brought a lawsuit challenging the racial discrimination in the Marshal Service, successfully challenging it. Today, he continues to assert that racism, and I believe I see him coming in now. Good morning, Mr. Fogg. Good morning. What a deep voice. I wish I had that. He continues to maintain that racism drives the war on drugs, and he'll be speaking about that this morning. He appears frequently on TV and radio and print, and holds 3 leadership positions in nonprofit government watchdog organizations. He's a board member of Amnesty International and the co-chair of the No Fear Coalition. He will be our first speaker, and we'll talk a little bit, talk a little bit about how race is inextricably a part of law enforcement. Mr. Fogg will be followed by Alexander Molter, who is in the middle, who joined the Neighborhood Defender Service in 2014 and works now with the Brooklyn Defender Services. No, I'm sorry. Is it the Neighborhood Defender Service? Which is located here in New York. He has in the past worked with the Brooklyn Defender Service and the Family Defense Project, and worked with the Public Defender Service of the District of Columbia as a trial division law clerk. The interesting and exciting thing, I was speaking with Alex before and comparing my experience 36 years ago working for the Legal Aid Society in Brooklyn and his work now with the Neighborhood Defender Service. And at the time that I was working, the first contact that you had with clients was the point at which they were arrested. So it was a point where the problem had reached that desperate point. In contrast, the Neighborhood Defender Services has a team that includes criminal and civil attorneys, social workers, investigators, paralegals, law school and social work interns, and pro bono attorneys. And they have something called the pre-arrest services, which can begin representing a client before there is a contact with law enforcement. And Alexander is going to speak a little bit about the services that they offer, about the impact that they see on communities of color, and some of the work that they're doing to address that. And finally, Mike de la Rocha, who is an artist, an entrepreneur, and an organizer. He's the founder and CEO of Revolve Impact, which is a social impact firm that combines organizing and the arts to drive communities to action. He was instrumental in launching the Justice Policy Network, and is a leader in dealing with the government sector in advancing a new justice agenda. And he has co-managed John Legend's Free America campaign. He currently advises members of Congress and other state and local elected officials on criminal justice issues. He is an internationally recognized singer-songwriter, is a featured artist for Rock the Vote, and was selected as one of Good Magazine's top 100 people for changing the world, has been recognized as a top innovator by the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and received the Hispanicized Positive Impact Award for his work. And he is going to speak a little bit about his work with communities and with the arts to further the agenda of having a positive effect on these our communities and ending discrimination in drug law enforcement. So sorry to get you up so quickly, Mr. Fogg, but we're each going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have questions from the audience. You have a choice either there or up here.
Well, as they say, welcome aboard Enterprise, everybody. Good to see you. My name is Matthew Fogg. I'm born and raised out of Washington, D.C., and certainly became a U.S. Marshal in 1978. I grew up actually in the Civil Rights Movement, so had a chance to see a lot of stuff, see Dr. King come to Washington, D.C., get a chance to see things, and I got arrested. When I actually was one of the ones who called the police, and the police came and they took down my name as a witness, but then when they got the names downtown, they got it twisted up. And I ended up they came and got me and arrested me. Another detective made a mistake, big mistake, but the problem is they came and got me on a Saturday morning. I had to stay almost literally 3 days in jail when they realized they made their mistake. And it was the most horrific experience of my life. But God was getting me prepared for something, because that whole incident was racially motivated, because the officer, white detective, he didn't want to hear nothing I had to say, and he was trying to tell me, he said, look, if you just say you did this, you don't have anything to worry about. I always remember that. I mean, you're 18 years old, you talk about an indelible effect on your mind. And when it ended and they released me, they just kind of released me from the basement cell block saying, sorry, made a mistake, over, young black kid growing up in D.C., no big deal. So I'm getting somewhere with this, because my point was, as I grew up and witnessed this and had that experience, and then I went away to college, Marshall University in West Virginia. Nothing to do with U.S. Marshall, nothing dealing with that, but one is one L, one is two L's. I got there, and then I began to see the racial disparities and how even our curriculums and what we were doing. And so I became president of the Black student body. Changed the name to Black United Students, BUS. I became the bus driver, of course. And then later, after getting my degree in criminal justice, I got out of school. I started applying for law enforcement jobs, and what? Lo and behold, that record comes up and stops me from getting a job in law enforcement. Stopped me. When they told me I had no record, I was flabbergasted. But the bottom line is, went through a process, got expunged, cleared off my record, everything, the mistake was cleared up, and then I got called by the U.S. Marshals. And when I got on this job, one of the first things I noticed when going to the academies and everything else, and I just straight up with people, I just tell people, this is just the way it is. This is the culture that we deal with. When I got to the academy, all of the training, your federal law enforcement training center in Glencoe, Georgia, you're learning how to shoot, when to shoot, who to kill, who to beat, everything. You're learning criminal law, you're learning all of the civil rules of procedure, stop and search, when to frisk, everything you can think of. Powerful academy, everything. We're learning it all. But I noticed something. A lot of the targets at that time happened to be the bad guys now. You go in these shooting scenarios and you try to win the shooting, win that. They had a lot of steel targets. A lot of these people turned out to be people of color. A lot of targets were people of color. That's one of the first things I noticed. So then, after, of course, coming out of the academy, and of course my class, predominantly all white, maybe one or two blacks in the class, and that's where all these classes were. So what you got is you got now a culture in place where and this is federal law enforcement, you can imagine what happens on the state and local level. And at that time, back in 1978, and then moving forward. So what we had this sort of contingency of people coming on there that didn't even understand. A lot of them, race didn't matter in the sense that as long as it wasn't them or somebody that looked like them. So when you start to get around, and I'm getting up to a point about even with the cannabis and the whole war on drugs and where we are now, being a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP. LEAP is an organization that was formed we had over 5,000 cops, judges, lawyers around the country, all begin to understand that the war on drugs is a failure. It's a failed policy. We all begin to understand that. But it took a lot, getting way down the road after the damage had been done for cops to start speaking out. I started speaking out early on in my career because it was obvious to me being there on the job and seeing the racial targeting and racial discrimination. I always said, if the war on drugs was an equal opportunity enforcement operation, the war on drugs would have ended a long time ago. Y'all understand what I mean when I say that? It was an equal enforcement opportunity operation. It would have ended a long time ago. Because it would have been just like alcohol prohibition. At some point, somebody had to come to the conclusion that alcohol prohibition wasn't working. It was creating more violence than it was creating good. So we as cops got together and formed this organization, said, listen, we need to form an organization. You can go to leap.org, go up on leap.cc, correction. You can go up on our website and check it out. But we formed the organization to say, we need cops, we're there on the front lines. Now, I got on the U.S. Marshal Service, and guess what? I ended up getting transferred or moved to Drug Enforcement Administration. Drug Enforcement, DEA was looking for somebody to go after their fugitives, and I was known as the top fugitive hunter in the country. I mean, my nickname was Batman. We were jumping out on people in the middle of the night from Seattle to Miami. I mean, all we needed was music in the background. And let me tell you something. And when you're talking about what we were doing, but we were targeting the war on drugs in the 80s when it started ratcheting up under the Reagan administration, even before that Nixon administration. And so now we're talking about this so-called war on drugs. And again, why are we talking about this racial component? Because it was a dynamic racial component. And I don't know if you recently, one of Nixon's top aides recently just came out and he admitted, he said the war on drugs was about a war on race. It's a race war. And I've been saying it from the time that I got on the job because I began to see who we were targeting. So I always remember, I would talk about this incident all the time. We set up these drug and gun interdiction task forces where we go around the country and we hit like 7 cities at a time, New York, Chicago, LA, Miami. And we setting this stuff up and we're in the war room, we're getting everything all set up and the areas we were going. Guess what? I noticed most of our targeted areas were urban areas. Now give me the name of an affluent area here in New York, right around here. What would you call it? Bed-Stuy? Would that be considered affluent? Best-Becoming. They don't do drugs over there though, right? Yeah, right. Okay. I mean, y'all get where I'm coming from. What I'm saying is we were targeting the urban areas. Now, this was a operation that we were doing. So when I began to see that's what we're doing, I spoke out against it. I said, don't they use drugs like in Cummings and some of these other locations that we knew about? You know what they told me? They said, Fogg, if we go in those areas, start locking those folks up, you know what's going to happen? They know judges, they know lawyers, they know politicians. They will shut our operation down. And there goes your overtime. There goes the money you're making. There goes the cars you're seizing, all the fun you're having, excitement, jumping out on people. That became ethnic cleansing. And that's why we see today, when we see the extraordinary numbers, 80% of the people locked up on drug arrests or, locked up are people or arrested are 80% were people of color. That is crazy. ACLU came out with this report showing all of the different racial disparities. I'm sorry, I wanted you guys to see the CNN tape where I'm up there arguing with a New York prosecutor on Don Lemon. Don Lemon is and guy is trying to say, well, that's because of the low-hanging fruit. That's why we locked up so many blacks and so many people for marijuana. And it wasn't just about marijuana. I said, yes, when I looked at the marijuana, a lot of times is the first charge that you wind up getting that now just sort of mushrooms into other charges. Once you got a record, once you got a charge, nobody's going to believe you anyway. Especially if you're somebody of color and you don't have no family, nobody to back you up. You did the crime. It doesn't matter. It's just like what that guy tried to get me to do. He said, look, you just go ahead and say, he said, you don't have a record. You go ahead and say you did this. He said, and you can go home. You know how many people want to go home, don't want to go into those jail cells and say anything? So when I begin to look at it, you start talking about cannabis, marijuana, we already understand law enforcement shouldn't be in the drug business at all. That's Leap's position. We should not be out there in that business. That is not us. We should be out there going after the murderers, the rapists, the gun toters, and all of those type of folks. Locking somebody up for weed? This is absurd. I mean, it doesn't even require a conversation. But again, why is it that way? Because of just what that top aide for Nixon administration said. He said, the war on drugs is about going after people of color. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is your government doing this, and this is what I was a part of. We were slave catchers. That's what I called us. And when I began to realize it, I turned. Yeah, I had to take on the government. I won a big lawsuit for race discrimination. They left me on a stake out to get killed because you don't blow the whistle behind the blue wall of silence. I'm now the retired chief deputy U.S. Marshal. I come looking like this because I want you to get an image in your mind of what it's like as a law enforcement operation person out there doing that job, but you working for the system that's telling you to go out and target certain people. Because if you go after the other ones, they're going to get laws and stuff and shut it down. So that's why the war on drugs has lasted much longer than alcohol prohibition. That's why it's been 2 decades of just literally changing the whole concept, the whole foundation of a lot of communities of color, because you put so many fathers and mothers in prison and left kids to have to raise themselves in the same vicious cycle over and over again. And we were a part of it as law enforcement. We were a part of it. So I guess, how's my time looking?
You're out.
I'm out of time? To God be the glory. Thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Good morning. My name is Alex Molter. I'm an attorney with the Neighborhood Defender Service in Harlem. We are the institutional public defender for Harlem residents. We represent folks who live above 96th Street in misdemeanor and felony cases here in New York. It's really exciting to be here today with a group of folks who are interested in change and in reform and turning the ship around marijuana issues, around the law, around how we talk about the science, about its healing potential. It's hard doing the work in courts. You're stuck with sort of black and white rules. It's nice to be in an environment where we're talking about change and talking about how to look forward progressively. I want to talk about some of the things that are happening in New York City. There's a lot of exciting movement in the right direction, but I also want to just talk for a second about what happens in Harlem, the legacy of racist policing and unfair drug laws and how they're enforced and how they've affected a generation of Harlem residents and really impacted that community in a way that's going to really take a long time to heal. I see it every day in folks who are on the older side of the age groups that we deal with. You look back through their rap sheets and you see their first real criminal justice contact was when they were a teenager and stopped for marijuana. And if you think about what that kind of contact and what that experience can do and how it opens the door to a future of interaction with the criminal justice system, it's really powerful. Marijuana enforcement has always been targeted on younger people, on kids and teenagers. And if you think about, well, what does it mean to get arrested for marijuana? Well, you get your mugshot, right? You get your fingerprints, you're in this database, and now you are in the system where you should never actually ended up in the first place. They have a tab on you, they know who you are. And every successive contact with the criminal justice system raises the stakes. So every time that you have an interaction, the stakes go up, the consequences are going to be more drastic. What maybe could have just sort of resulted in maybe looking the other way the first time now turns into a violation, and now it's on your record. And then it's a misdemeanor, and now it's really on your record, and it's not something you're going to be able to get away from. And that's happened to a generation of folks who have lived in Harlem, where a simple misdemeanor conviction impacts your family, if you have a family court case. If their children were present when you were arrested for marijuana, that can lead to Administration for Children's Services being involved, having a civil case pending while you also have a criminal case pending. Can affect your immigration status. Two marijuana convictions are, we call them CIMTs, crimes of moral turpitude. 2 of those on your record can make you deportable. It obviously affects employment, can marginalize you and actually lead to less stability, less opportunity. It can also affect your housing with your eligibility for NYCHA, for New York City Public Housing. there's been a lot of interesting reform issues going on, and one of the issues that we see here in New York is that de Blasio's administration has decided to not arrest for low-level marijuana offenses. Police have an incredible amount of discretion, right? There's on the street, there's a lot of flexibility and opportunity for police on an individual level to determine how they're going to do their job. But one of the things the de Blasio administration has talked about is instead of arresting folks and costing the system about $1,000 to $2,000 for every single marijuana arrest, what we're going to do is issue summonses. And for those who don't know, a summons is basically like a traffic ticket. It says, we're not going to book you, you're not going to come through central booking and go to arraignments, but you're going to have to show up to court on a future date. And you're going to be brought in front of a judge, and there's going to be some fine paid. It's not going to be on your criminal record. But let's think about what that process looks like. It's great, right? Everybody, I think, could agree that, let's stop arresting folks and find new ways to deal with this problem. It's surely in the right direction, right? Summonses are better than arrests. It's not ideal. It's not maybe the perfect scenario that we would all envision where marijuana maybe is legal. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. But I think there's a danger in that. And the danger is that unless you're really going to talk about over-policing and systemic racism in the New York City Police Department, you're going to take the racist, marginalizing system that we have where we arrest and book people for marijuana and just replicate that system in the summons system, where poor folks of color are being brought to court, asked to pay a fine. When they aren't able to pay a fine, a warrant is going to be issued. That's going to lead to a whole series of other problems that I can get into in a minute if we want to go there, how warrants actually play into this. When the de Blasio administration came out and was talking about sort of stopping, no longer arresting folks for marijuana and moving towards this summons-based system, the NYPD was not keeping track at all of the racial breakdown of who received summonses. So just think about that for a second, that we have a system where it's actually, we have these conferences because we know that there's a problem, because we have statistics in the disparate impact of drug laws on communities of color. But shifting towards a summons-based system is sort of clouding over that issue. We're not going to have that same data. I know there was legislation pending in New York to try to require the police department to keep those statistics. I'm actually not sure if it was passed. Maybe somebody here might know. But that seems an essential part of actual reform, because if you're moving to a system where it's really now about economic punishment, right? About having folks come into court, having them have to pay a fine, take a day off work. Possibly if you miss a court date, you're going to have a warrant. You're going to get picked up on an open warrant by the warrant squad of the NYPD. You can see those collateral consequences. And if we aren't keeping track of how the police are issuing summonses, then it's all for naught. Then there is no real progress here. This really, from my perspective, is an over-policing problem. All of our clients are living in Harlem. A lot of them are people of color. A lot of them live in New York City public housing, where it's very aggressively policed by the police department. They actually have arrangements with private apartment buildings that allow them to do a sweep of the building, where they can come in and sort of look for trespassers. And every single day in Manhattan criminal court, I meet folks who have had experiences such as the following. This actually happened to me last week. A young man, 24 years old, was standing in the lobby of his friend's building. The police came in, they said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Oh, I'm on my way up to my friend." They're like, "Where does he live?" He's like, on the 4th floor. They said, "Hey, we don't want to give you a hard time, but do you have anything on you right now?" And he's like, "Yeah, I have a little something." He's like, what do you have?" He's like, "I have a small bag of marijuana." And they're like, "Let us see it." So he takes it out of his pocket and he shows it to him. And right there is actually the commission of the crime. When you have marijuana in public view, that's a misdemeanor. That's an arrestable misdemeanor. Police do that type of tactic all of the time. It's a consent search. It's sort of impervious to trying to really challenge, because under the authority of their badge, under the color of coming into a building and trying to, from my client's perspective, minimizing his problems, he's going to cooperate. And what they do is they phrase these intrusive searches as questions, as ways to get you to consent. So saying to somebody, "Hey, you know what, we don't want to give you a hard time. You're a young kid, but we just got to do our job. You should just tell us right now, if you got anything." A 24-year-old kid who has no contact with the police, which my client didn't, thinks he's doing the right thing, thinks that he's going to be able to kind of just, make this go away. Maybe he even thinks that marijuana is actually legal in New York and that this isn't going to be a problem. Taking it out of his pocket is not going to get him arrested. But it in fact does, and the police now have an arrest, works towards their quota, and that young man finds himself in the system and having to deal with me all day. It's those types of tactics that happen all the time in New York City. And if we really want to see how change in marijuana and change in enforcement, it really comes down to honest conversations about how the police do their job, about systemic racism in the police department, and how to really change the conversation from the substantive law about what's legal and what's not, and focusing also on how is it policed, how are we enforcing this in our city, and what type of collateral consequences are we creating for folks that just further marginalize them. So I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
How's everybody doing? Good. My name is Mike Della Rocha. I'm an artist that happens to be an organizer happens to be an artist from Los Angeles. Proud son of a father who immigrated from Mexico when he was 7. My mother's a second generation Chicana. I'm one of 4 or 5 people on my mother's side who's never served time in prison or jail. And I've dedicated my life for about 17 to 18 years to try to figure out how we could transform our current justice system. About a year and a half ago, I started a company called Revolve Impact, in particular to look at how can we utilize arts and culture to influence not only the hearts and minds of people in America and around the world, but in particular, how do we influence policy? Today, 1 in 4 of us in this room, 1 in 4 of us when we go outside this room has a criminal record. That's roughly 65 million people. When this entire war on people started, there was less than 200,000 people in our American prison system. Today we have 2.3 million people. If you add the people that are under probation and parole, that's another 7.3. That's roughly 10 million people that are either in prison, in jail, in an immigrant detention facility. That's the most ever in any country in any time in human history. We roughly spend $80 billion. That's the GDP of 133 different countries. And back to the point earlier, as a father of 2 amazing children, 2.3 million children today in America have a loved one that's incarcerated. The massive toll of mass incarceration on our economy, on communities, and in particular communities of color have taken a devastating toll. About a year and a half ago, when we started this, I had the great fortune of helping pass a proposition in California called Proposition 47. And what Proposition 47 did, it did 3 things. It took 6 low-level crimes, mostly drug possession and petty theft, and it reclassified them from a felony to a misdemeanor. The second thing it did is it took the savings from that, which was roughly $150 million, and reinvested it into things that we know work: education, treatment. And then the third thing that it did, and this goes back to the tangible results of our policies, is we wrote that bill to be retroactive. And what that meant was roughly 1 million Californians that had been brutalized by the war on drugs can now apply for a job and not have to check the box that says felon. 1 million Californians can now live in Section 8 housing and not be kicked out. 1 million Californians could apply for a Pell Grant like I did and go to UCLA. 1 million Californians now could register and vote for the first time. And what we did in California, we became the first state to not only reclassify, reinvest, and be retroactive, but we showed what was possible when we all came together in our different forms of influence. I started something called Artists for 47, and one of the artists in particular that we were working with was a man named John Legend, a famous singer-songwriter, won the Grammy for his song Glory with Common last year for the movie Selma. And he was on tour in London, and we contacted him and said, will you help us do what's needed to win elections, which is the hard work of door knocking, phone banking, and talking to community residents. And so he did that, and what ended up happening was we were the most trended anything on the ballot of that year, but more importantly, he saw the impact that we as artists can make. I've been privileged to be mentored by a man named Harry Belafonte for about 8 years, and he's always taught me that the role of artists in particular is always to be what Paul Robeson has said, the gatekeepers of truth. And by that, we have the ability to really think more boldly and radically about what is possible out there. And I always say the thing when I say I want to end the war on drugs or I want to end all youth incarceration, people will look at me and say, Mike, you're crazy. But if John Legend says it, they actually stop and think for a second. Yeah, that could be possible. And so a year and a half ago, we started a campaign called Free America. And it's a campaign to amplify the growing movement that we have in America right now. And we live in a pivotal time right now where politicians, legislators, the general public is thinking about these issues in deep and powerful ways that haven't happened before. And a lot of that is because of the Black Lives Matter movement that is forcing us to have a real conversation about race and justice in America. And so our goals as a campaign are really twofold. One is we believe our level of incarceration should be reduced by 85%. And that's pushing further than most people that are saying 50%. But our rationale is that today in America, we have the same level of crime that we had 40 years ago, and therefore our incarceration should be the same. Our rate of incarceration should be the same. The second thing is that would put us in alignment with the rest of the world that looks at our laws as draconian and brutal, and it doesn't take a lot to go overseas and see that there's a better way of dealing with this issue. And the second thing, we feel that no young person, regardless of crime, should be ever incarcerated in any type of facility. When you look at what incarceration does, not just to the individual, but the family, you can see the ramifications are really big. And so today, when we look at every 37 seconds, someone is arrested for marijuana. The thing I would like to just really point out is most of the time that person arrested is a young person of color who's poor. And what's going on right now, as someone that gets the ability to travel a lot, is I go to states like Colorado and Oregon, and I see this above-ground economy coming up. I have friends moving to other states and making millions of dollars in this new gold rush. But the thing that bothers me and the thing that I challenge all of us to think more about is how do we give access to those communities directly impacted by the war on drugs? I have cousins and uncles that are currently and were incarcerated for drug possession that have no access to this above-ground economy. Once they come out, they still have a felony. They can't access these businesses. There's no acknowledgement of the pain and real consequences that this war has had on urban communities. And so as I have no doubt that we will end this war on drugs in our lifetime, and at some point, 50 states in this nation will legalize cannabis. But if we do not give access to those communities most devastated by the war on drugs, we're continuing the hypocrisy and the racial dynamics that we're talking about here today. The systemic racism that is deep in the sense that we can't even access the economy that people are now running to make a lot of money doing. And the one thing I will end on, because I know I want to jump into questions, is that at the state level, if we cut all drug offenses by half, that would only reduce our overall incarceration system by 7%. Right here in New York, if we halved all of our drug arrests, that would literally decrease it by 1%. And so the question for us is like, how do we all work together in realizing that this system of mass incarceration that the war on drugs is a part of needs all of our sustained effort to really roll back policies that have been created for 40, 30, 20, 10 years. And part of that means really looking at those that are incarcerated for serious and violent crimes. If we reduce just that population by 15%, that will do more than cutting all drug offenses by half in every state. And so I'm asking us to reimagine a different justice system, one that really puts compassion, humanity, and mercy at the center of it, and one that really looks at how do we all work together to humanize our loved ones that have been impacted, but also realizing that the war on drugs is part of a larger economic and criminal justice system that continues to profit off the misery of a lot of us in this room and outside of this room. And so the challenge before us is exciting because it took us 40 years to get here, and it's going to take a sustained movement to move us out. But I'm very hopeful because I see what's going on not only in streets but in conferences like this, and that we can do things differently, and people are now finally acknowledging the fact that you can no longer demonize those because 1 in 4 of us have a record. If I asked how many of us know someone that's been impacted by the criminal justice system, I'd probably argue the majority, if not all of us in this room, would raise our hand. And so that money is our money to be used, again, on education, on job creation, on things that we know will make our economy, our society, everybody better, and help heal kind of the fracturedness that this entire war on drugs has caused in our families. So I thank you for your attendance because these kind of conversations are critically important to become more educated, to meet each other, and to really find ways that we could collaborate to change the system that we live in today and to create something that we know is a lot more better and beneficial for all of us. So thank you.
Thanks.